Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine a nefarious neuroscientist kidnaps you, implants a chip in your brain, and then wipes your memory of the event. The chip gives you the persistent desire to throw stones into water. Now, as luck would have it, a wealthy family member wills you their cabin by the lake. You move into the cabin and spend your days doing what you most desire to do, the pointless activity of throwing rocks into the lake. Do you live a meaningful life? In this video, you'll learn what philosopher Richard Taylor would say about this case. You'll learn Taylor's take on the myth of Sisyphus, and we'll consider 3 objections to his theory of life's meaning. Welcome to the Philosophical Life. This channel is devoted to deepening your understanding of philosophy. As a professor, I've helped lots of people better understand key philosophical concepts, theories, and thinkers. I look forward to doing the same with you. Click the subscribe button and the bell icon to not miss any future videos, and stick around until the end of this video for a special bonus. Now, let's get this thought party started. We often take for granted that our lives have meaning. We might assume that being a good person and helping others makes our life meaningful. Making a positive impact on the world, isn't that the meaning of life? Not necessarily. The ripple effects of our positive acts over time will fade. Most of our accomplishments won't last. The reality is, we leave our possessions and projects to the next generation, they pick them up and repeat life's cycle. It's easy to begin thinking life's without meaning. In fact, Richard Taylor thinks looking at a meaningless life can shed light on what gives life meaning. You'll see how he does this in just a minute. In doing this, he arrives at the thesis that the meaning of life is purely subjective. Life has meaning based on the perspective of the subject of the life. If the subject has rightly oriented desires, which for Taylor focus on the process of doing things, not the products or achievements of doing things, then life has meaning for that person, and that's all the meaning there is to life. It comes wholly from within us. Now let's see how he argues for this thesis. Taylor thinks the myth of Sisyphus illustrates a meaningless existence. Unlike Albert Camus, Taylor isn't in the business of reinterpreting the original myth. If you're interested in a video that breaks down Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, check out the video here. A meaningless existence involves endless, pointless activity, an existence full of activity that never culminates in anything. The person's existence is like a broken record that just keeps repeating the same small phrase over and over. Sisyphus committed transgressions against the gods, as you may know, and then they condemned him to an eternity of difficult and pointless labor. He must repeatedly roll a heavy stone up a hill, only to have it never reach the top. It just tumbles back down to the bottom, and then he starts hoisting the heavy stone again. Perhaps Sisyphus's life is meaningless because his life is full of physical pain and suffering. Taylor thinks this doesn't work. He asks us to consider something like a relay race. But it's not really a race. There are no rules. There's no way to win. Imagine one person, for instance, just like carries a tiny rock to a point, another person picks it up, and then that person carries it to a different point, and then the original person returns the pebble to the original point. And then the cycle starts again and just keeps repeating endlessly. There's no physical suffering in this endless pebble relay, yet for Taylor, if this was the sum of the existence of the two people, then their lives would be meaningless. It's as if the people are hamsters on a wheel, endlessly spinning but going nowhere. The original Sisyphus case involves endless activity that just feeds more of the same activity. Now this raises important questions. How might our lives differ from the life of Sisyphus? How might our lives have meaning that Sisyphus's lacks? Or are our lives similarly meaningless? Our meaning might come from creating beautiful and lasting things. We often do this through art, architecture, and technology. Sisyphus doesn't create anything of lasting beauty. Taylor points out that if, quote, Sisyphus hoisted stones to the top of the hill and created a beautiful and lasting temple, then his activity would no longer be pointless. It would amount to something, end quote. Do our lives resemble the original Sisyphus case, or the temple building Sisyphus case. Taylor argues that all creaturely life resembles the original Sisyphus case. Taylor notes that life in general is endlessly cyclical. Its activity feeds a literal life cycle, a cycle that just is designed to perpetuate life, which ends up in new life that repeats the same cycle over. Consider bioluminescent cave-dwelling worms. Strange, I know, right? These worms use light to attract insects. They eat the insects, the small worm becomes an adult, and then the adult can't eat because it has no parts that allow it to eat. It lays eggs and dies. As Taylor remarks, quote, "This meaningless cycle has occurred for millions of years and only feeds itself so that it can keep going on for another million years," end quote. Think about the migration of birds or the arduous journey of salmon to lay eggs and die shortly thereafter. These literal life cycles are designed to produce offspring that repeat the same cycle. As Taylor reflects, quote, "This life of the world thus presents itself to our eyes as a vast machine, feeding on itself, running on and on forever to nothing," end quote. Thus, life in general most closely resembles the original Sisyphus case. So, living things roll their stone to the top, only to have it fall back down so the process can begin again. They produce new life that will repeat the same cycle. Of course, humans are part of creaturely life, but you might wonder, like, don't we differ from creatures that are lower in the pecking order? Like, we have consciousness and the ability to reason. We're aware of our goals and we can freely choose them. Lower living things act primarily from instinct. They're not aware of their goals as goals, and they don't freely choose them. Yet, despite the cognitive differences, we too resemble other creatures in the repetitive activity designed to perpetuate life. Think about how repetitive daily life is. As Taylor observes, quote, "Look at a busy street any day and observe the throng going hither and thither. To what? Some office or shop, where the same things will be done today as were done yesterday, and are done now so that they might be repeated tomorrow," end quote. That activity is part of raising up the next generation of people that will take over. Whereas Sisyphus must go to the bottom and roll the stone again up the hill himself, we leave the stone at the bottom of the hill for the next generation to pick up and roll. As he says, quote, "Most such effort is directed only to the establishment and perpetuation of home and family, that is, to the begetting of others who will follow in our footsteps to do more of the same," end quote. We also resemble original Sisyphus in that, quote, "Our achievements, even though they are often beautiful, are mostly bubbles, and those that do last, like the sand-swept pyramids, soon become mere curiosities. Our achievements come to rubble. They lose their beauty and functionality. Think about a town like Detroit, where parts of it are abandoned. Think about ghost towns, places that were once bustling with activity. Now the shell of a town remains." As Taylor memorably explains, quote, "On a country road, one sometimes comes upon the ruined hulks of a house and once extensive buildings, all in collapse and spread over with weeds. A curious eye can, in imagination, reconstruct from what is left a once warm and thriving life, filled with purpose. There was the hearth, where family once talked, sang, and made plans. There were the rooms, where people loved and babes were born to a rejoicing mother. There are the musty remains of a sofa infested with bugs, once bought at a dear price to enhance an ever-growing comfort, beauty, and warmth. Every small piece of junk fills the mind with what once, not long ago, was utterly real, with children's voices, plans made, and enterprise embarked upon," end quote. Taylor concludes that, quote, "Humans do achieve things. They scale their towers and raise their stones to their hilltops, but every such accomplishment fades, providing only an occasion for renewed labors of the same kind," end quote. So our lives don't resemble the temple building version of the Sisyphus case. Now let's consider how Taylor thinks life takes on meaning. Unlike the original Sisyphus case, we often care about the process of creating things. Sisyphus doesn't care about rolling the stone to the top of the hill. Yet, Taylor tweaks the case. If we imagine Sisyphus had a substance like put in his veins by the gods that makes him most want to roll stones, then his life would take on meaning for him. He'd be able to do what he most desires to do. Leaving everything else the same in the case, it wouldn't matter that his stone rolling never amounts to anything. So this is the desire fulfillment version of the case, and it makes it such that, quote, his life is now filled with mission and meaning, and he seems to himself have been given an entry into heaven, end quote. Sisyphus is doing what most aligns with his deepest desire in life. So for Taylor, meaning appears on the scene. His desire to roll stones is irrational, but for Taylor, this doesn't matter. Now, in just a bit, we'll consider an objection involving this part of his view on the desire fulfillment case. Taylor thinks this case is better than the temple building case. So for Sisyphus, it avoids the infinite boredom of him building his temple and then being stuck contemplating his achievement for eternity. He avoids this form of hell and instead is granted a form of heaven, a life of desire fulfillment in the form of stone rolling. Thus, for Taylor, the meaning of life is to pursue activity that it is your will to pursue and aligns with your nature, regardless of how it got there. That is, whether it's hardwired by nature, implanted by the gods, or chosen after careful reflection. Now, Taylor makes the bold claim that, quote, even the glowworms I described, whose cycles of existence over the millions of years seem so pointless when looked at by us, will seem entirely different to us if we can somehow try to view their existence from within. Their endless activity, which gets nowhere, is just what it is their will to pursue, and is its whole justification and meaning. Nor would it be any salvation to the birds, who span the globe every year back and forth, to have made a home for themselves, them in a cage with plenty of food and protection, so that they wouldn't have to migrate anymore. It would in fact be their condemnation, for it is the doing that counts for them and not what they hope to win by it. Flying these prodigious distances, never ending, is what it is in their veins to do, exactly as it was in Sisyphus's veins to roll stones without end, after the gods had waxed merciful and implanted this in him, end quote. Thus, the meaning of life is an inside job. It's a matter of how we view things, and it's a matter of having rightly oriented desires. Such desires focus on the activity and process of doing things. They don't focus on the accomplishment or the end products of doing things. As Taylor memorably concludes, quote, the meaning of life is from within us. It isn't bestowed from without, and it far exceeds in both its beauty and permanence any heaven which men have ever dreamed or yearned for, end quote. There are three objections to Taylor's view on life's meaning that we'll consider. The first objection is that the view is too subjective. The second objection targets an assumption about the good life underlying his view. And the third objection is that living a life of meaning requires free will, and Taylor's view overgeneralizes in applying to beings that don't act freely. The first objection is what prompts philosophers like Susan Wolf and Christine Vetrano to add an objective element to their view of life's meaning. Simply changing how a person views a pointless activity doesn't eliminate the fact that the activity is still pointless. It doesn't culminate in anything, and it doesn't have value beyond the value assigned to it by the subject. The whole story on the meaning of life cannot be as Taylor regards it. To see this, let's return to the case that kicked off this video. The person who gets kidnapped and implanted with a chip that gives her the desire to throw stones into water is granted, remember, as Taylor might say, entry into heaven. Her life circumstances have bestowed on her the ability to endlessly fulfill her deepest desire. She can sit by a lake and throw stones into a lake forever. Yet, intuitively, a life that involves nothing more than throwing stones into a lake is not a meaningful life. The activity that fulfills her desires doesn't contribute to her community, family, or society. It's not objectively meaningful. It doesn't have value beyond the value the subject gives it. What do you think? Must the desire being fulfilled involve activity that's objectively meaningful, or can even pointless activity that fulfills one's desire lead to a meaningful life? Now, the second objection is that the view of the good life underlying Taylor's view is problematic. The view of what the good life is what makes life go well for a person, what contributes to her well-being. For Taylor, it's a matter of getting what you want. It's a matter of desire fulfillment, where those desires focus on the doing of things that align with what you're naturally inclined to do. What's nice about the desire fulfillment theory of the good life is that it accounts for many ways of living the good life. I might desire to coach baseball. You might desire to cook desserts. Another person might desire to write novels. As long as our desires are fulfilled, we're all living the good life. Life is going well for all of us. But there are many objections to this theory. One objection is that we're often mistaken regarding what's good for us. We often have misguided desires. If I desire to become a famous rock star because I falsely believe that they live a life that's carefree, then when I become a rock star and discover all the pressures and stress that comes along with it, then having my desire fulfilled, has it really made my life go well for me? I wanted carefree living. Now I've got pressure from my record label, the fans, my manager, and so on. How might Taylor respond to this objection? Now, Taylor might require desires to be informed. I had a false belief that the glamorized rock star lifestyle would somehow be easy living. Were I better informed about what it's really like to be a famous rock star, I would see that what I think is good for me is really bad for me. If Taylor made this move, he'd be committed to the following principles. So if something fulfills our informed desires, those not based on false beliefs, then that thing is intrinsically good for us. And if it helps us to fulfill our informed desires, then it's instrumentally good for us. Now, there are problems with this new principle, though. If you want to hear about them, leave, quote, informed desires in the comments. The final objection we'll consider is that the view overgeneralizes. It applies to glowworms, birds, salmon, and irrational desire-fulfilling Sisyphus. For Taylor, they all live a meaningful life. That his view applies to such creatures should give us pause. What might explain why his view overgeneralizes? Well, it applies to creatures that don't act freely. Acting freely requires being able to act for reasons. It requires being able to see something as a reason to do something. It requires being able to decide to do something on the basis of that reason. If a creature lacks the cognitive capacity to appraise reasons as reasons, or the creature is manipulated into acting compulsively in satisfying irrational desires, that creature or person doesn't act freely. Worms, birds, and salmon lack the cognitive capacity to act on the basis of reasons in the required sense. And irrational desire-fulfilling Sisyphus is acting based on reasons that have circumvented his rational capacity. He does what he does because a substance was put in his veins, not because he sees rolling rocks, rolling that stone as providing a reason to roll that stone and satisfy his desire to do so. Now, why does activity that contributes to life meaning require acting freely? Imagine a robot acting out its programming. Does a robot live a meaningful life because it's doing what it was programmed to do? What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave them in the comments. I think robots don't live meaningful lives. It's a category mistake to apply meaning to them. Similarly, I don't think glowworms, birds, or salmon live meaningful lives. They're just doing what instinct programmed them to do. It doesn't make sense to talk about their life being meaningful for them from the inside. Consider when Taylor says, quote, "Even the glowworms I described, whose cycles of existence over the millions of years seem so pointless when looked at by us, will seem entirely different to us if we can somehow try to view their existence from within, end quote. It's a category mistake to apply subjective meaning to glowworms. What would it even be like for the glowworm to view its life as going well for it? Setting aside the fact that glowworms aren't likely conscious, it's clear that they lack the cognitive capacity to act for reasons. It's odd to even talk about desires being fulfilled for the glowworm. Additionally, Taylor thinking that desire fulfillment Sisyphus embodies what's needed to live a meaningful life should give us pause. Sisyphus endlessly performs an activity he's been manipulated to compulsively perform. Many philosophers think acting compulsively on the basis of irrational desires is freedom undermining. And many philosophers think being manipulated to do something by a nefarious agent or neurosurgeon is also freedom undermining. It can also undermine moral responsibility for our actions, as free will is a requirement for moral responsibility. Thus, the meaning of life requires the ability to act freely and to be morally responsible for what we do. Now, what do you think? Let's critically evaluate the thesis, and why do you think it? Do you think the arguments for the thesis are persuasive? Why or why not? Do you find the 3 objections to Taylor's view persuasive? Why or why not? And how might Taylor respond to any of those objections? How would you reply to his response? Now here's the special bonus. I'm going to encourage you to conduct an experiment in living. So how might you creatively experience Taylor's thesis in your life? Philosopher John Stuart Mill thought we learn about the good by conducting, quote, experiments in living. As philosopher Elizabeth S. Anderson summarizes about Mill's stance, quote, conceptions of the good must be tested out by the experiences we have in living them out, not merely by comparing them with ethical intuitions, end quote. It's one thing to consult your intuitions about cases when thinking critically about the meaning of life, yet it's another thing to test out that theory by living it out. Now, the special guidance in testing Taylor's view is to consider the following questions. Thinking of Taylor's view as offering an experiment in living, how could you change how you approach your life in a way that applies Taylor's view? Ask yourself, what should my life be like for it to possess meaning? Given that we can evaluate and deviate from having process-focused desires, because we're prone to our desires shifting to the end products of our actions and we chase shiny distractions, our, quote, our deepest interest in what we find ourselves doing, end quote, waxes and wanes. So as it does, so too does our meaning of life for Taylor. So how might you live a meaningful life that reflects a deep interest in doing what you find yourself doing? How might that align with your natural inclinations and passions? I'd love to hear your thoughts about experiments in living. If you conduct one, please come back and let us know how it went. And as always, keep thinking critically and creatively experiencing answers to life's ultimate questions, that is, keep living the philosophical life.